there's two things real quick. One, the balls that NASA would have to send people into Earth with a rocket that had the amount of testing done to it is extremely large.
I mean, at that point, the populace should be upset.
Yeah, but the second point, the same guy who said that the reason we haven't went to the moon in a long time is because we lost the technology, who said it in that interview that you were talking about.
Don Pettit.
Yeah, and this was after the moon landing.
And just for like a layman real quick, lower Earth orbit, is that like where all the space stations are, basically?
Yeah, basically. For example, you have parking orbit. So when the Apollo missions blasted off low Earth orbit, you would have what is called a parking orbit, which would be about 100 miles. So low Earth orbit would be anywhere between maybe 120 to 200 miles. And then you have above 200 miles, you would have medium Earth orbit and then high Earth orbit. Low Earth orbit is really anything that's about 200 miles in altitude. If that's a circular orbit, I'm not talking about, perigee or anything like that, just our apogee. I'm just talking about a circular orbit, would be about 200 miles. So, yeah.
This is digressing a little. It's a little random, but do you happen to know off the top of your head, or if you have it there, do you know the geosynchronous orbit, like what that distance is? If this satellite is positioned over the center of Texas, it will always be over the center of Texas. Like the satellites we use for Dish Network and all that kind of stuff, what that distance is from the Earth.
Yeah, they can be up as high as 10,000 kilometers here. And this is the astronaut that you were talking about, Paul. So Don Pettit is a NASA astronaut who was on 3 missions, 2 on the ISS, the International Space Station, and 1 on the Space Shuttle. He had this to say about the possibility of any future manned mission to the moon. And his quote is exactly this: "I go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have that technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again," unquote. That's a loaded statement.
Oh, yeah.
That is a very loaded statement. And the other thing that I've noticed, too, is that you have other statements from astronauts. For example, Alan Bean, he was asked by Bart Sibrel, did you have any effects of radiation? Did you feel any effects of radiation when you went through the Van Allen belts on your way to the moon? And Alan Bean's reply was, "I don't think we went out that far." And think about that. He says, "I don't think we went out that far." And Bart Sibrel pointed out, well, you had to go out that far and even further to get to the moon. And then he comes back and Alan Bean goes, "Oh yeah, you're right, we went out that far." No, I don't think so. No effects. And then later on, he tried to cover his tracks by saying that he was also on the Gemini missions. I think he was on the Gemini missions, and that, of course, they didn't go out that far. Gemini missions were a 2-man crew, and that was a low Earth orbit mission only. But, I mean, he already let it out, right? So they themselves don't know the full details because they forget the script.
I think
they're all reading the script.
Buzz Aldrin's like the biggest case, because it was like a year or two ago where he had that interview with like a 3rd or 4th grader.
Hey, I think that we actually went. Or, hey, I think it was all fake. Whether you're either side of the fence, I think it is a good idea to look at the math and the numbers and the stuff that you're talking about instead of like the photogrammetry. Like, don't look at the photos and the video and all that, because like you called it a red herring earlier. If you're going to argue your side, whatever side it is, focus on the math, focus on the engineering side of things, not what photos and videos we've seen.
But hold on real quick. They're photoshopped because they have to be. And that's also from a NASA spokesperson.
Well, I'll back you up on this a little bit, Johnny, right?
Mm-hmm.
I try to stay away from any direct criticisms of him for the simple reason, I mean, he has suffered depression and alcoholism over the last several decades. And if anybody in any family knows, that's serious shit. I mean, it's just serious stuff. I've had it in my own family, and I don't like what it does to people. I don't like what it does to people close to them. And the amount of pressure that he too was under, and I'm not making excuses for him because he lived a lie and he put forward a lie and he has to answer for that. But he also, think about his programming that's breaking down, and he screws up once in a while, the amount of pressure that he's under, and he knows he's living a lie, and having to live a lie, that size lie all your life is going to take its toll on anyone.
Let me ask you this, in general, especially for the Apollo missions, especially for the timeline we're talking about back in the late 60s, early 70s and everything. Are they actual astronauts or are they actors? Like, do they actually know the science? Because if you're going to fake all this, why would you not hire the people who are the best at acting and know what they're doing in that aspect of playing this ruse and this facade and everything, why would you not get the best at that instead of getting the best astronauts who aren't actually going to do the mission, and now you have to teach them how to act?
Like you said, they're all military. Sorry, but go ahead, Randy.
It's a good question. And my immediate response to that question would be is that they did need people with technical backgrounds, but with the image to go with it. If you remember, they built up the image of Neil Armstrong as a National Guard pilot. I think he was a National Guard pilot. I know he had some involvement in the military, but especially Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin in Korea, apparently had shot down the enemy, and it was actually videotaped, filmed, and they made, they're building the narrative for years later. I think these people were actually in mind years before the Apollo missions were announced. And so they did have to have some people with technical backgrounds.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. So you needed real people who were already credible, basically.
Yeah, credible, but credible with an aviation background. They needed that to sell the narrative. Back then, there was no engineering school there's no aerospace school for rockets. I mean, it was all new. It was brand new. I mean, a lot of these engineers that were working on the Saturn V were basically aeronautical engineers. And they had to learn all this themselves. There was no school to go to back then. So they were building the narrative, and they needed those ready-made, the all-American, and don't get me wrong, I like America. To me, it's what it symbolizes. I like a lot. So I'm up here. I'm a Canadian, right? So I like America, but it did symbolize that all-American sort of image, and the clean cut, aviator, hero. As it turns out, long story short, we'll get into this some other time. They didn't really need aviation skills to go into space, as it turned out. As one of the astronauts who was a scientist proved. Right, but it did fit the image, the narrative at that time. So yeah, you can get actors in there who would be probably a lot better at it, but keep in mind these were also military pilots, and they were very controlled and very scripted. But there were cracks forming even back then about some of their behavior. I mean, there's a rumor, and this is just a rumor, okay? And I like to put rumors out there because it gets people thinking, but it's just a rumor. Can't substantiate it. It is a rumor that one of the astronauts was actually caught having an affair with somebody else's wife. The problem is that at the time he was having the affair, he was supposed to be on a lunar surface. So,
honey, I wasn't sleeping with her. I was on the moon.
Yeah. I was on the moon. I like that. Right? So, for all the people out there that are going to attack me for saying that, I can't substantiate it. It's just a rumor. So if it's a rumor, I'll say that. But, that's exactly what that was really about. The all-American, Air Force hero and military pilot. And these were skilled pilots. I mean, these were test pilots. These people were very, very skilled in what they did. But how did that translate into actually flying a spaceship, rather? But that's another issue. So it would be better to have the real thing and then train them, as opposed to getting actors and then trying to train them on that.
Gotcha.
The reverse would be a little bit more difficult.
A lot of people already know this, but you can go back to whenever Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, they all came back from that first mission. They were quarantined for however long, but whenever they were able to actually talk to the press, and if you watch that specific interview with them, you watch their demeanor, you look at them, you can tell they're not actors, but you can tell, like, dude, if I just came back from the moon and I was the first person on the moon, like, I would be ecstatic. I would be, I'd be on cloud nine. Common sense would tell you as a human being, like, something is off here, in my opinion.
Yeah, I watched it. It's about an hour and a half. It wasn't easy to sit through, I tell you. It was the most depressing press conference I've ever seen. And that's including press conferences about actual real catastrophes. I've heard the NASA proponents, I like to call them, I'm being kind when I call them NASA proponents, they'll come back and say, well, they did smile a couple of times. And you see, if you go to this time here, he smiles. I mean, but overall, it was the most depressing thing you could ever watch. As somebody put it aptly, oh, the joy, right? These people should have been jumping up and down and on the stage doing somersaults and we did it. And, there was actually even some conflict going on there between some of their astronauts, because some of them, and Neil Armstrong a couple times, tripped up on what he was supposed to say and what he shouldn't have said. Yep. And you could see it. There was a moment there where Michael Collins was kind of correcting him and saying, well, I didn't see that, and basically saying you didn't see it either. And it's interesting that in the transcripts of that press conference, it's reversed. I won't go into the details of it right now. I don't have time, but the transcripts are reversed in terms of a couple of the comments that were made to give the impression that it wasn't this astronaut that was saying it, was this astronaut that was saying it. So there's deception going on there as well. But you can clearly see that they had the weight of the world on their shoulders in that press conference, especially Neil Armstrong. I think of all of them, he was the one that was really wearing it the most. Because remember, he was the first man on the moon. His name is associated with it. And I might add, there isn't very many still photos of Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface. Any still photos you see, I think there's 2 of them that are actually kind of dark and muddied a bit. And any other frames you see are coming from film. He wouldn't pose. Right? His behavior is very interesting to look at. His is the one I find the most intriguing. Buzz Aldrin second. Michael Collins loved it. I think he just loved the limelight, right? But Neil Armstrong's behavior is very, very interesting. And I mean, as I said earlier, he basically became a recluse. So I think the behavior in that press conference speaks volumes about the weight of the world on their shoulders at that time, because they knew they were going to live their whole lives with this lie. They had no way out. They were under orders.
This is all real, as in, we never went to the moon. Then, he would die before he ever even got close to disclosing that information. And not just him. I mean, because you can.
Anyone
it's
involved.
easy to. Yeah, exactly. It's easy to stop one person. You can be like, I'm so righteous that I will tell the truth. But when they also threaten your family and your friends and everybody it's a little harder to do that.
Absolutely, and that's another fact too that we need to keep in mind. And I mean, also, it's important to remember that that deception also hurt their families and blew their families apart, or some of their families apart as well. So it wasn't a walk in the park for any of these people involved. And again, I want to be clear to everyone and the viewers, I'm not making excuses for these astronauts, because they have to answer for the fact that they participated. But at the same time, it isn't always black and white. And I try to look at it I try to sort of look at it from different angles, if I can put it that way. But the bottom line is that they did participate in a deception, and that deception needs to be answered for.
But you have the empathy for them at the same time, because you realize the position that they were put into, and it's almost just like that kind of fell into their lap. And next thing you know, this crazy government power is like knife to their throat, basically, probably in a bunch of scenarios. Like, what would you do, kind of thing, like that level of empathy? Like, yeah,
it's easy for us to say, I guess, that, well, no, I wouldn't participate in that. I'd like to know that I wouldn't. At the same time, when we put it in the context of the times back then, the Cold War, you're doing a service for your country, you're going to inspire millions of Americans, this is going to help nationalism, it's all about hubris, all that. I mean, the American flag, son, do it for your country type of thing. I think a lot of people would have done it. And, let's not forget, they were probably well paid, not overtly, but, indirectly. And, so, I mean, there's that aspect of it as well. But hey, why wouldn't anybody, of course you're going to be paid for this, right? Yep. But yeah, factor in that they too were part of mass mind control in terms of the Cold War, which I now believe that's what it was. It was nothing more than a mass mind control program. The Soviet Union and the Americans never took one single shot at each other. Not one. They fought through proxy wars, yes, but they never fired a single shot at one another. That says a lot. I wonder if it was all scripted. I mean, you got half the Soviet Union hierarchy now that's infiltrated American academic institutions and political institutions in the United States, as well as China, but that's another story. So yeah, there was a lot more going on. The depth of this goes very far. The rabbit hole goes very far. And there isn't one easy answer to all of this, but there is a lot of discussion and theories around it, for sure.
I really wanted to ask questions about Bill Casing. Well, and I'm sure you've heard of him if you're any kind of involved in the moon conspiracy and everything, because he's kind of considered the father of this whole conspiracy. He was the first quote unquote whistleblower of the entire ordeal.
Yeah, no, I'll talk about Bill Casing right now. Bill Casing's a very interesting person in all of this. I happen to think that he's very genuine. A bit of background on Bill Casing. He worked for Rocketdyne. And Rocketdyne, by the way, is the corporation that built the F-1 engines. And he was hired by Rocketdyne in 1958. So he saw firsthand, he analyzed the data of the F-1 engines. And he was disgusted by what he was seeing, because the F-1 engines were not performing to specifications at that time. And that's very significant, because up to 1963, they were like, 3-4 years away from a moonshot. And these F-1 engines were not performing. And he has alleged that the F-1 engines data were falsified. The numbers were fudged. So he left in disgust in 1963. He resigned. And contrary to what a lot of the NASA proponents will say, he was nothing more than, a paper pusher. He was more than that. He was hired for his skills. He was good at analyzing data. He was collecting that data, and that was his job. Of course, he came out with his book in 1977, which was the first book, you're right. And he basically alleged in the book that the Saturn V launched. It was a stripped down version of the Saturn V, basically empty. There was no crew on board, and if there was a crew, there was nothing else on board. There was no lunar module. But he's basically saying a stripped down version of the Saturn V, that they had substituted the F1 engines for another engine. Nobody would know the difference. I mean, they can be camouflaged. And that was used to sell the narrative, because you have to keep in mind that, there was about 1 million people there that day at Apollo 11. Something did blast off that day. I mean, there was a rocket that went up, but was it the Saturn V in every aspect that they were talking about? And according to Bill Casey, no, it's not. And now his work is being validated by a couple of Russian scientists that have come forward, because no American scientist is going to touch this. And they published papers on the Ollis.com website. And Ollis.com is devoted to the deception around the Apollo missions. And he has done, he's a scientist, and he's done a thorough examination of the F1 engine. He's basically validated exactly what Bill Casey has said. Now, they differ a little bit in the method, but the bottom line is the same. The Saturn V did not leave the launch pad as a 3,000-ton rocket, possibly 2,000 tons, maybe even less than that. It had no lunar module on board, and as far as I'm concerned, had no crew on board either. It was far too dangerous to put a crew on top of a rocket that had a total of 4 minutes testing.
I'm trying to think to myself, back then, I guess you wouldn't have to inform the public, but I feel like during the time when all this is going on, the public could have somehow known whether or not they were doing tests and stuff. And I feel like the populace in general would be outraged that you're putting people in this rocket that, hey, you guys haven't fixed this shit yet. Or you say you fixed it, but you haven't tested it out. I don't know, that whole part. I've never heard that part before, and that's crazy to me.
And that's the beautiful thing. They never even had to answer that question because they successfully went to the moon.
Yeah, you're right.
You know what I'm
right.
saying?
Yeah. It all gets shrouded by...
Yeah.
And the other thing to keep in mind, too, is back then, 50 years ago, nobody had access to personal computers like we do.
Everyone still had a telly, though.
Yeah, everyone had a telly, and that was, Walter Cronkite told you what was going on, and, that's the mainstream. Well, we had ABC, CBS, and NBC, and that's where we relied on our information. Once it got past its 50-mile altitude, out of range of cameras, nobody knows where that rocket went. I believe the whole thing went right into the ocean, but that's another story. We won't have time to get into that now, but that's another story. But nobody knows. We only know from the mainstream narrative, from Walter Cronkite at that time, who was narrating this, where that rocket went. So we had to rely on NASA through the mainstream media to get our information. Nobody had access to the information that we do now. So it was very easy to keep that secret. 1 million people were there watching the launch of Apollo 11, but they don't know where it went after it was out of range of camera, out of media camera range. There's a couple of researchers I would like to mention. One I mentioned was Scott Henderson. And there's another researcher I want to mention, and he's highly recommended. He's the UK distributor for Nexus magazine, and his name is Marcus Allen. And I had a chance to sit down and have dinner with him for 5 hours, and he's a wealth of information. He's devoted the last 25 years of his life to researching the Apollo moon missions. He's available for interviews. I highly recommend you get him on here. He is a wealth of information. And the other one is Emmanuel E. Garcia, MD. He writes about the psychological aspect as well as some of the technical aspects, and that's on the Ollis.com website. Robert Williams, he actually does my video. So when I make a video, I have my own YouTube channel, but then he takes that and he puts it on his own YouTube channel. He enhances it. And, I'm not always, the best to come in when it comes to special effects on YouTube videos. So he does that for me. He's brilliant too. And Phil Kautz is another one who's a physicist and he does a lot of good work. These are all names that I have access. Now, in terms of going to books, there are many books on the Apollo missions, on the Apollo moon mission hoax. I recommend to the viewers, if you really want to get involved in this, you really want to find out the answer, read the official books on the official version of the Apollo missions, because a lot of really fantastic nuggets come out of those. You have scientists that indirectly tell you that it's amazing that these missions even happen. It's a miracle that nothing happened on the way there, and they're basically hinting that wink, 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 it didn't happen. They're not going to come out and say that because they have careers to think about, but they more than say it outside of NASA, but in the context of the official version. So you have to read both sides of this. You have to read the official books on the missions, the official narrative, and you have to, as well as the books on the hoax aspect, the conspiracy aspect of it. You put the two together. You can't just read one side. You have to read both sides.